Detective Jackson Kane stood on the deserted pier, the ocean breeze whipping through his coat as the waves crashed rhythmically against the wooden posts. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the small coastal town of Everwood. It was a picturesque place, known for its tranquil beauty and charming cottages, but today, it was overshadowed by a cloud of mystery and tension. Edward Grayson, a wealthy businessman whose name was synonymous with power and influence, had vanished without a trace. His disappearance had sent shockwaves through the town, stirring whispers of foul play and hidden enemies. The local police had found no clues, no leads, and no sign of struggle. The case was rapidly becoming one of the most baffling investigations Jackson Kane had ever encountered. Kane, a seasoned detective with a reputation for solving even the most perplexing cases, had been called in to handle the situation. He had spent the day interviewing witnesses and reviewing the scant evidence available, but so far, the trail had gone cold. As he walked along the pier, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Edward Grayson had been last seen at a local restaurant, a place frequented by the town's elite. According to the staff, he had been accompanied by a woman whom no one seemed to recognize. Descriptions of her varied, but one detail was consistent: she had an air of mystery about her, as if she were hiding something. Her name, as Kane discovered, was Lydia Martin. Lydia Martin was a name that had surfaced in various circles around town. She was a former actress who had vanished from the limelight years ago, only to reappear recently with an enigmatic presence. Some claimed she was involved in underground circles, while others spoke of her as a woman with a dark past. Kane knew that if he were to solve this case, understanding Lydia Martin would be crucial. The detective made his way to Lydia's modest apartment on the edge of town. It was a small, unassuming building that seemed out of place compared to the grandeur of Grayson's mansion. The door creaked open, and Lydia Martin stood in the hallway, her expression guarded but calm. "Miss Martin?" Kane introduced himself, showing her his badge. "I'd like to ask you a few questions about your last meeting with Edward Grayson." Lydia's eyes flickered with a mix of surprise and apprehension. "I don't know what more I can tell you," she said, her voice steady. "I was with Edward, but I didn't expect anything unusual." Kane noted her composed demeanor and the slight tremor in her voice. "Can you tell me where you went after you left the restaurant?" Lydia hesitated, then replied, "We went for a walk." Edward seemed troubled. He mentioned something about needing to make a deal, but he didn't elaborate. Kane's mind raced. "What kind of deal?" "I'm not sure," Lydia said, shaking her head. He didn't provide details. It was clear he was trying to escape something, but he wouldn't tell me what. As Kane probed further, Lydia's story remained consistent but vague. She claimed that after their walk, Grayson had asked her to meet him later that night at a secluded location, but she had decided not to go. The detective could sense there was more to her story, but she was unwilling to divulge it. Kane left Lydia's apartment with more questions than answers. The missing businessman was connected to a woman with a complex past, and the implications were troubling. He had to consider all possibilities. Did Lydia know more than she was letting on? Was she an accomplice or merely a pawn in a larger scheme? The investigation continued to unravel, with Kane poring over financial records, personal connections, and any potential motives. Grayson's business dealings were fraught with tension and controversy. Rumors of corruption, shady investments, and strained relationships with local officials painted a picture of a man who had made many enemies. As Kane analyzed the evidence, he couldn't ignore the feeling that this case was more than just a simple disappearance. It was a puzzle with missing pieces, and Lydia Martin seemed to be at the center of it all. The detective knew he had to navigate through layers of deception and betrayal to uncover the truth. The serene facade of Everwood had been shattered, revealing a world of secrets and lies beneath. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jackson Kane was determined to bring Edward Grayson back and uncover the hidden motives behind his disappearance. Detective Jackson Kane continued his investigation into Edward Grayson's mysterious disappearance, diving deeper into the enigmatic life of the missing businessman. With each passing day, the case grew more complex, and Kane's initial suspicions about Lydia Martin became increasingly pronounced. Grayson's vanishing act was no ordinary disappearance. It was surrounded by layers of deceit, betrayal, and unanswered questions. Kane started by examining Grayson's financial dealings, uncovering a trail of dubious transactions and murky investments. Grayson's business empire, built on a foundation of real estate and finance, was rife with conflicts and questionable practices. The businessman had been involved in several high-profile deals that had stirred controversy and animosity. As Kane sifted through the paperwork, he found connections to organized crime, shady characters, and a myriad of disgruntled partners. It became evident that Grayson's wealth and influence had earned him numerous enemies. Among those enemies was a local politician named Charles Donovan. Donovan had clashed with Grayson over land development projects that had impacted the town's infrastructure. The two had been embroiled in a bitter dispute, and Donovan had publicly criticized Grayson's business practices. Kane knew that Donovan had a motive to wish harm upon Grayson, but the politician had an alibi for the night of the disappearance. However, Kane was wary. Donovan's resentment towards Grayson made him a person of interest. Another lead took Kane to the local dockworkers, who had seen Grayson's luxury yacht frequently docked but had no recollection of any unusual activity on the night he vanished. Yet, Kane couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the dockworkers' testimonies. He decided to scrutinize their statements further, suspecting that their silence might be hiding something significant. The investigation then turned its focus to Lydia Martin, whose role in the case seemed to be growing more dubious. Kane was particularly interested in her background, which revealed a complex history of failed careers and personal struggles. Lydia had once been a successful actress but had fallen out of the public eye under mysterious circumstances. Her return to Everwood had been sudden, and her association with Grayson raised eyebrows. Kane interviewed her again, pressing for more details about their relationship and the nature of their interactions. Lydia's responses were evasive, yet she remained composed throughout the questioning. She insisted that her connection to Grayson was purely professional, claiming that he had sought her out for advice on various business ventures. However, Kane found discrepancies in her account. Lydia's financial records indicated that she had received large sums of money from Grayson, which she had failed to explain satisfactorily. As Kane delved into Lydia's past, he discovered that she had been involved in several dubious ventures and had connections to individuals with criminal backgrounds. This led him to question whether Lydia had been more deeply involved in Grayson's affairs than she was letting on. Her demeanor suggested that she was hiding something, but whether it was her own involvement or a larger conspiracy remained unclear. In a breakthrough moment, Kane received an anonymous tip that suggested Lydia might have been involved in a secretive meeting with Grayson shortly before his disappearance. The tipster claimed that the meeting took place at a secluded cabin outside of town, a place known for its discretion and privacy. Kane decided to investigate this lead, hoping it might provide crucial evidence. Arriving at the cabin, Kane found no immediate signs of a struggle or confrontation. However, the interior was eerily pristine, as if it had been recently cleaned. On a desk, he found a partially burned letter and a few scattered items that suggested the place had been hastily abandoned. The letter, though damaged, mentioned a deal gone awry and a plan to escape. The contents were not entirely legible, but the words escape and betrayal stood out clearly. Returning to town, Kane confronted Lydia once more, presenting her with the findings from the cabin. Lydia's reaction was one of shock and panic, confirming that she had indeed been to the cabin but refusing to divulge the details of what transpired there. She maintained that she was not involved in any criminal activities and that Grayson's disappearance was beyond her control. Kane's investigation had led him to a crossroads. He now had to decide whether Lydia was a victim caught in the web of Grayson's deceit or a co-conspirator with her own agenda. The shadow of doubt hung heavy over the case, with every lead pointing towards a tangled network of lies and betrayal. As Kane pieced together the puzzle, he realized that Grayson's disappearance was not a simple case of someone running away to avoid trouble. It was a carefully orchestrated scheme involving multiple parties with vested interests. The detective had to navigate through layers of deception and hidden motives to uncover the truth. The once peaceful town of Everwood had been transformed into a stage for a dramatic and unsettling mystery. Kane's resolve to solve the case grew stronger with each passing day, knowing that uncovering the truth behind Edward Grayson's disappearance required unraveling the complex web of relationships and deceit that had ensnared Lydia Martin and others. The investigation into Edward Grayson's disappearance had reached a critical juncture. Detective Jackson Kane had pieced together enough evidence to suspect that Lydia Martin's involvement in the case was more significant than initially thought. With every clue pointing towards a deeper conspiracy, Kane's patience was wearing thin. The mystery had grown more intricate, and the pressure to solve it was mounting. Lydia Martin's evasion and the clues found at the cabin hinted at a hidden truth that needed to be uncovered. One evening, as the town of Everwood settled into its usual calm, Kane decided to confront Lydia once more. He had reviewed her statements, cross-referenced her financial records, and examined every lead. The detective was convinced that Lydia held key information that could crack the case wide open. He arranged to meet her at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, a place where he hoped they could talk without interruptions. When Lydia arrived, her demeanor was noticeably different. The facade of calm she had previously maintained was gone, replaced by an expression of anxiety and weariness. Kane invited her to a corner table where they could speak privately. As they settled in, Lydia's hands trembled slightly as she sipped her coffee. "Miss Martin," Kane began, "I've reviewed everything you've told me, and I have to say, there are inconsistencies. I found evidence suggesting you were more involved with Edward Grayson than you've admitted." Lydia's eyes widened in alarm. "I told you everything I know," she said, her voice quivering. "I've cooperated fully." Kane leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I found a letter at the cabin, and it was clear that something significant happened there." The words escape and betrayal stood out. "I need you to be honest with me. What was your involvement with Grayson?" The detective's direct approach seemed to break through Lydia's defenses. She took a deep breath, her eyes darting around as if searching for a way to escape the conversation. Finally, she exhaled heavily and began to speak, her voice filled with a mixture of resignation and fear. "All right," Lydia said quietly. "I'll tell you the truth. Edward Grayson wasn't just a businessman to me. He was my partner in a scheme that was meant to protect us both. But things went terribly wrong." Kane listened intently as Lydia recounted the events leading up to Grayson's disappearance. She explained that she had been deeply involved in a plan orchestrated by Grayson, which involved fraudulent financial dealings and illegal activities. The plan had been to use Lydia as a cover for these activities, allowing Grayson to continue his business operations while avoiding scrutiny. According to Lydia, Grayson had promised her a share of the profits and protection from any fallout. However, as the scheme began to unravel, Grayson's paranoia grew. He started to believe that everyone was out to get him, including Lydia. The businessman had begun to plan his own escape, intending to leave the country and start anew. Lydia was supposed to help him with this plan, but when she realized the full extent of Grayson's deception, she decided to turn against him. "The night he disappeared," Lydia continued, her voice breaking, "he told me he needed to meet with someone who had information that could help us. He wanted to make a final deal, one that would ensure our safety. I went with him to the cabin, but when we got there, he told me it was too late. He said he needed to disappear to avoid being caught." Kane's mind raced as Lydia's confession unfolded. "And what happened after that?" Lydia hesitated. "Grayson told me to leave. He said he would take care of things himself. I tried to convince him to come with me, but he was adamant. He wanted to disappear and start over, leaving everything behind." The detective was struck by the gravity of Lydia's admission. Grayson's disappearance wasn't just about evading justice, it was a calculated move to escape the consequences of his actions. Lydia had been caught in the crossfire, used as a pawn in Grayson's elaborate scheme. "But why didn't you come forward earlier?" Kane asked. "If you knew about the plan, why keep it hidden?" Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "I was afraid," she admitted. "I thought that if I came forward, I would be implicated in his crimes. I didn't want to end up in prison. But the guilt of what happened to him and my involvement became too much to bear." Kane nodded, understanding the fear and desperation that Lydia must have felt. Her confession had unveiled the truth about Grayson's disappearance, but it also highlighted the complexities of the case. Lydia had played a significant role in the scheme, but her actions were driven by a desperate need for survival. The detective took detailed notes as Lydia described the final moments she spent with Grayson. It became clear that he was no longer in Everwood. He had vanished to avoid facing the repercussions of his actions. The trail had grown cold, but Kane was determined to find out where Grayson had gone and bring him to justice. As Lydia finished her confession, Kane reassured her that her cooperation would be taken into account. Her involvement in the scheme had been a matter of survival, but it didn't absolve her of responsibility. However, her willingness to come forward would weigh heavily in the investigation. With Lydia's confession, the investigation had taken a crucial turn. The next steps involved locating Edward Grayson and unraveling the full extent of his criminal activities. The mystery of his disappearance was slowly being resolved, but the search for justice was far from over. With Lydia Martin's confession in hand, Detective Jackson Kane was now faced with the daunting task of locating Edward Grayson. The businessman's elaborate plan to disappear had left few clues, but Kane was determined to see the case through to its conclusion. The small coastal town of Everwood was no longer just a picturesque retreat, it was a labyrinth of secrets and deceit, and the detective was at the heart of it. Kane's first priority was to follow up on Lydia's claim that Grayson had intended to escape the country. He cross-referenced the details of her confession with travel records and checked with local ports and airports for any signs of Grayson's departure. It was clear that Grayson had been meticulous in covering his tracks, but Kane was relentless in his pursuit. After days of exhaustive searching, Kane received a tip from an informant who had overheard a conversation about a man resembling Grayson preparing to leave on a private yacht. The informant, a dock worker with connections to the maritime world, provided Kane with the name of a secluded marina where Grayson might be hiding. The detective arrived at the marina late one evening. The place was quiet, with only the soft hum of the water against the docks breaking the silence. Kane's heart raced as he approached the slip where the informant had indicated the yacht was docked. It was a luxurious vessel, its sleek lines and opulent design suggesting that it belonged to someone with significant resources. Kane approached the yacht cautiously, his senses alert for any signs of activity. As he boarded, he noticed that the boat was eerily quiet, the interior seemingly deserted. The yacht was equipped with all the amenities one would expect of a high-end vessel, but it had a sense of abandonment, as if its owner had left in a hurry. The detective searched the yacht meticulously, examining every nook and cranny. It was not long before he stumbled upon a hidden compartment in the captain's quarters. Inside, he found a series of documents, including travel itineraries, maps, and correspondence. The document suggested that Grayson had been planning his escape for weeks, with detailed plans for reaching a safe house in another country. Kane's eyes narrowed as he read through the documents. It was clear that Grayson had intended to disappear completely, leaving no trace behind. But the detective was determined not to let him slip away. With the evidence in hand, Kane contacted local authorities and requested their assistance in tracking Grayson's movements. The investigation soon led Kane to a remote area on the outskirts of Everwood, where Grayson had apparently set up a temporary hideout. The location was a small, dilapidated cabin isolated from the rest of the town. Kane approached the cabin with caution, knowing that Grayson could be dangerous and desperate. As he neared the cabin, Kane heard muffled voices inside. He carefully peered through a window and saw Grayson pacing the room, his face etched with anxiety. The sight of the elusive businessman, so close to capture, fueled Kane's determination. He knew this was the moment he had been working towards for so long. Kane decided to confront Grayson directly. He called for backup and prepared to enter the cabin. The detective's heart pounded as he approached the door, his hand gripping his weapon tightly. With a deep breath, he kicked the door open and stormed inside. Grayson looked up in shock, his eyes widening as he saw Kane and the arriving officers. The businessman's initial reaction was one of anger and defiance, but it quickly turned to desperation as he realized the gravity of his situation. Grayson tried to negotiate, offering bribes and making excuses, but Kane was resolute. "Edward Grayson," Kane said firmly, "you're under arrest for your involvement in financial fraud, conspiracy, and the disappearance of several individuals, including yourself." Grayson's bravado crumbled as he realized there was no escape. The once powerful businessman was now cornered, his plans unraveling before him. He attempted to flee, but Kane and the officers were quick to restrain him. The confrontation was intense, with Grayson struggling against his captors, but ultimately, he was subdued and taken into custody. As Grayson was led away in handcuffs, Kane felt a profound sense of relief. The case that had begun as a mysterious disappearance had been resolved, but it had revealed a web of corruption and deceit that extended far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Grayson's arrest was a significant victory, but it also marked the beginning of a long legal process. In the aftermath of Grayson's capture, Lydia Martin's role in the case was re-evaluated. Her cooperation and the crucial information she provided had helped bring Grayson to justice. While she still faced consequences for her involvement in the scheme, the legal system recognized her assistance and the difficult position she had been in. As Kane closed the case file, he reflected on the journey that had led him to this point. The investigation had been a challenging one, filled with twists and turns, but it had ultimately revealed the truth behind Edward Grayson's disappearance. The small town of Everwood could now begin to heal from the shock of the scandal, knowing that justice had been served. Detective Jackson Kane walked away from the case with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face the next challenge that awaited him. The resolution of this case had not only brought closure to those involved, but had also reinforced Kane's commitment to uncovering the truth, no matter how complex or elusive it might be.